document that has been put out for consultation, and we'll be interested in your views on a range of matters. So just the usual sort of housekeeping, just to let you know, the session here has been recorded, and the recording of the slides may be placed on our website for those wanting to review the presentation. And we're looking into that at the minute. We're hoping to try and get something up on that fairly soon for some of the previous sessions. This is the third session in a series that's taking place more or less weekly until mid-October about our discussion document. There's an any questions or a Q&A function, sorry, that you should see on your screen. And if you're asking a question, it can be useful to record the slide number just for reference. But if you have any difficulty, you can email directly at info.bru@finance-ni.gov.uk if that Q&A function doesn't work. We've just to sort of brief everyone, we expect that people watching this will have some reasonable familiarity with the current building regulations regime. So apologies if it's very technical or if it has gone in that direction. Our consultation runs from the 26th of July until the 15th of November. And the documents are available at the usual search there, if you, consultations web page. Responses go through via Citizen Space, which is the usual kind of slightly interactive format. There are a lot of questions, but they are broken into sections. We'll be looking at 2 of those sections today. And if you have any queries, you can always email us or contact us again. So today's session is looking at section 3B and 4B of the document, which really relates to proposals in relation to Part F, that's conservation of fuel and power of the building regulations in relation to existing buildings. So really what that's about is when work is being carried out to existing buildings, what standard should that work have to attain? And there are other cases where you have a material change of use, which can be relevant or important. And that's usually a case where you aren't actually doing any work. You're just using an office building. Now you're going to use it in a different way as a dwelling or something, but you're not actually carrying out any construction work, or you weren't intending to carry out any construction work. So those are the 2 kind of situations that that we'll be kind of covering, or are all covered within the domain of what is work to existing buildings and what we're talking about today. Really important kind of thing to just be clear about here is we're not talking about minimum fitness standards or requirement to bring all existing buildings up to a certain level of performance, or there are other proposals from other departments or other potential proposals from other departments around things like minimum energy efficiency requirements for private rental sector buildings, things like that. They're not what's being discussed today. We only apply under these 2 conditions when work is being done, or whenever there's been a particular change of use that is relevant to the building regulations. As a general kind of theme, we're just noting that technical risks can be significantly greater in retrofit situations, and that can be due to the nature of the existing building and the variety of situations that can be there. And it can also be because, for example, you can't always get access to install the components or control junction details without significant disturbance, or and the work is just often more difficult. Often less certainty about the existing materials you're dealing with and their particular nature. So all of those things mean that you can have unforeseen risks, or risks in that area are need managed in a more careful way, and that may mean that we have a slightly lower standard may actually be more appropriate, and often in some of these situations, than it would be for a new build situation where you've real control over all of the details and everything else that's happening. And we also note that there are always, and it's important to consider as well, that there are always impacts on other parts of the building regulations. So perhaps ventilation is required as you insulate to address indoor air quality or interstitial condensation risks. But other parts like fire and structure and things like that are obviously impacted by what it is you're looking at. So that always needs to be considered and maintained throughout. So we're taking that as a bit of a given in the conversation and in the rest of the presentation. So we've got it in two parts: existing dwellings and then existing buildings other than dwellings. And many of the themes in the existing dwelling section are very similar in the proposals or in the measures for buildings other than dwellings. I should say as well, actually, that these sections here are really focusing on next steps in this area. So this is the phase 3 proposal. We have a program, a 5-phase program. Our discussion document that we're talking about here is phase 2. The next uplift will be what we call phase 3. So the section 3B and section 4B are our next steps proposals for for the standards for works to existing buildings, and they follow very much in line from developments in England and in the other administrations in a similar way to some of the previous sessions that we've talked about. So section 3B relates to standards for a variety of situations. There'll be standards for extensions, for new and replacement elements and services, for renovation of an existing element, or if you were to bring that element into the building, if you were roofing over a rear yard and the wall around that yard would now become part of the building, that would be kind of a kind of situation like that, perhaps. There'll be a retained element. And where a greater or lesser number of dwellings is created by a change of use in an existing building. There are also two important terms that those of you who've worked with the building regulations should probably be familiar with. That's consequential improvements and major renovations. So the documents give a bit of extra kind of consideration around those, because they're kind of specific things that we'll talk about. So we talk about these standards in general, and then we move to those specific scenarios, those specific situations. In terms of the regulations, then the general requirements tend to stem from regulations that sit within Part A. So that's Regulation 6 and Regulation 7. Regulation 7 applies to the structure and the envelope. Regulation 6 is the application to services and fittings. Regulation 8 is a bespoke table of what bits apply where whenever you have a material change of use, and has other considerations in it beyond that, of course, but Regulation 8 is what's governing that. Whereas these other issues like consequential improvements and major renovations are really scoped out or stem from some requirements which flow from the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the energy efficiency requirements, some of them are known as. So there's Regulation 41 and Regulation 43, and they're kind of quite particular and come from that history and through that route. So we've mentioned in an earlier session about a legislative refresh. So what we have here, obviously you can't read it all, but what we have here is the extract on the current legislation for Part F. There's a lot of it, and a lot of it has flowed from the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Some of the wording in it, we think there ought to be some scope for improvements or simplification there. So we have a general question in section 2 of the document, actually, but I think it's just worth highlighting here, where we ask about a legislative refresh around that. It's just worth, we've just sort of compared it to Part D. There's Part D by comparison for structure. So there's quite a difference there, and the general intent of the building regulations would have been that regulations should perhaps be more akin to the likes of Part D, with a general overall kind of reasonableness or adequate level of performance or requirement, and then the details really provided in the technical guidance. So if we can have a legislative refresh and try and simplify and come, I don't think we'll get back to the simplicity of Part D, but if we can maneuver back toward that approach, that's something that I think is a bit of an aspiration for us when we come to look at that, if it's possible. So question 2A.4 asks about that and asks about your ideas around that. So it's worth bearing that in mind, particularly as we come to look at aspects of consequential improvements and major renovations and things. So that'll come up a bit later. We also have a general theme around traditional construction. So there are aspects of Part F and things don't necessarily need to be applied, and must correct that slide actually, but that, because it's not quite right, it should really be referring to Article 3A, but that the enforcement can be applied taking into account the character and appearance of the building, and then some of the aspects of Part A also, or Part F, sorry, are also explicitly excluded. So and that's catered for in Regulation 38. So we need to, that when it comes to traditional construction or protected buildings, but they're really looking for the character and appearance. And we're interested in whether that might be extended, because we can see that vapor permeable and traditional construction is a more it's an area where careful judgment is really needed. So we're looking to see what might be done around that as a general theme throughout the document. So if we're setting standards, do we have different standards for traditional construction, or do we refer out from that? But clearly the assessment of traditional construction and its ability to support renovation measures is a developing area. There's lots of new things coming through with multiple interacting issues. And so it requires a balancing and a considerations in each case. So we're alert to that, and it's a bit of a theme that flows through the consultation. However, in general, just, I'm sure most of you are aware, but it's just worth reviewing or reminding, there are generally three approaches, particularly when you're looking at extensions. But the three approaches are a kind of standards-based approach, a calculated trade-off approach, and an equivalent carbon target approach. So we'll discuss those now, but it's important to realise that not all of those approaches are available to all situations. So, for example, a calculated trade-off approach mightn't necessarily apply when the majority of the measures you've got are existing or renovated elements. There's a kind of cost-effective thing you should do to a renovated element, and that kind of applies throughout the process. So we'll come to this as we go through it. But the standards-based approach is obviously the most straightforward approach. It takes each item, whether it's a wall, a window, a boiler, a radiator, whatever it is, and it sets a requirement for, what, if it's retained or if it's a new element, what the standard for that new element or that retained element ought to be if you're doing work to it. So if you're building that, or if you're renovating it. And so we've got there the current table for the minimum U values for new thermal elements, which appears in the current guidance there. And if you follow each of that, and each step and each part of your building meets that requirement, then that's fine. The calculated trade-off approach is an alternative approach where you can have a lower standard in one area, provided you improve the standard in another, and it generally relates to the U values of elements only. So it's not looking at services. It assumes that you're meeting all the minimum services requirements and allows you to calculate. And as long as your average U value has performed in the same way to the U values for each of the thermal elements, then that's acceptable. And that would be used a fair bit in extensions, and particularly perhaps where a more glazed extension than the limit that would be assumed under the standards-based approach is needed. I'll just go back a slide. Have we got that in the standard slide? No, it should have included there a note that glazing limits would apply in that, and so this would be one way to have additional glazing if that were something that you wished or wanted. And then the third approach is an equivalent target approach. You can take a whole a more holistic model, so you could balance some services, some renewables, some U value values, and again you can model that against the standards-based approach. So you design your building as per the standards-based approach, you model that, you design the building the way you want it to be, and you model that. And if the emissions under the second are no worse than the emissions under the first, that can allow you to construct to that level. So that provides really quite a lot of flexibility, particularly because you could then incorporate measures in the existing building to compensate for maybe a slightly poorer standard in an extension, or by adding renewables you can offset. So there are various kind of provides quite a lot of flexibility where it's permitted. And the important thing that we're noting here is, if people were at the last session, they'll know that there were two new metrics to be brought on board. One is primary energy, and the other one in England only, which we are thinking of following, is the fabric energy efficiency standard requirement. So as well as the current emissions requirement, if under this equivalent target approach, the proposal or the expectation might be that you have to also meet the primary energy performance and the fees, the fabric energy efficiency performance, in the same way that you do for your emissions requirements. So that's kind of what our first question is about, as to whether that's the way forward. And it would seem to provide a more complete assessment and be more in line with the options for new builds and things. So certainly as regards extensions and that, this seems to be, a logical continuation on from some of the discussions had in the new build requirements section. So as we've kind of indicated, there's in terms of elemental standards, the guidance across all of the regions provides for a variety of situations with terminology. So there's different terminology or different solutions, and different outcomes are available depending on the kind of extent of work you're doing. And in the document, I've kind of pseudo or tried to sort of rank them from extensions down to retained elements. So extensions and new elements tend to have a kind of situation A level of standards. Broadly speaking, you're looking at standards similar to new build situations, whereas situation B are really where you're retaining elements and retaining structures, and perhaps renovating them. There's usually a different, often a lower standard of performance expectations for that. You'll notice that the material change of use is kind of dotted in one and dashed in the other, because that's kind of the crossover point about what standards or what expectations you should expect to see. But as I've noted there in the bullet points at the bottom, the more onerous new replacement standards will always apply to any new replacement elements in preference. So broadly, this ranking or this hierarchy, you have to ask yourself, have I got an extension or am I building new elements? Well, those are the standards then that are going to apply. And then you work your way down through that list as to which situation is expected to apply. So when we come to look at the building fabric, which I think is probably the most concern or significance to architects, the standards that have been adopted in the other regions have been uplifted to come more broadly into line with new build expectations. And I think that is quite a significant uplift there. So if you look here, we see that there's a very big improvement in the standard that's expected then compared to the current position. So our new build requirements were uplifted recently in June 2022. They came into effect, but there was nothing done to uplift the standard for new elements and extensions and things along with that. So that will catch that up and also bring it into line with the expectations for new builds after the next uplift that would come through. So these give you a flavour of the kind of U values that are proposed. There's not a huge amount of difference between the different regions and what have you. There is a whole building approach and things to this sometimes applies, and whether you can offset and trade, and to some degree that's relevant, because it impacts when you can do a calculated trade-off or not, and how that all kind of works. But broadly speaking, the Republic of Ireland, Scotland and Wales, they're directly applying their limiting standards. So the lowest standard that would be acceptable for a new build is what they've put in. So that's what they've done. Whereas England has England has higher limiting standards, so but it also then has a fees requirement for its new build. So it has kind of split the difference a bit more between its fees values and its new build requirements. But you'll notice there the big one, I suppose, and the interesting one is for walls. It's kind of expecting that walls should achieve 0.18, which I think is quite significant. So we believe that that's kind of halfway between new build limiting values and its notional dwelling values. So the notional dwelling is the model that you have to broadly match in terms of emissions, primary energy, and fabric performance in England. England's consultation noted that its standards are intended to reflect the highest standard for each element, which is still cost effective. So our expectation is that England and other people have looked at this and they're applying a standard that they feel is appropriate for their region and for the UK. We would need fairly convincing evidence, I suppose, as to why we wouldn't adopt a similar standard here. Those standards, they're saying that the standards they've proposed are technically achievable for the vast majority of work currently being done to existing dwellings and should not, importantly, that they should not pose a significant risk in moisture if appropriately considered. England and Wales, yeah, a minor kind of thing is, and the kind of thing we'd be interested in. I mean, England and Wales proposed a delayed implementation for timber windows and door manufacturers. They give a kind of 3 or 4 month, from June to November 2023. So an extra time there. I think that should be June 2022 to November 2023. So an extra 18 months, I suppose, or additional year, I've said, for retooling and product development for this sector. So they've retooled for that. So, if there are similar concerns, or if there were a particular issue, or there was some reason to delay some aspect of this, I mean, we'd certainly be open to consider that if the evidence or if industry were to come forward on that. But there would need to be a sort of reasonably convincing position for that, or rationale for that. We look again then at situation B. So these are the standards for renovated elements and what have you. It's important to note that in cases of a change of use, the extensions to the glazings is a 25% of the total floor area rule applies. So bearing that in mind, but the situation B standards there, if you look at them for walls, are there's 0.3 and 0.25, so they're kind of a different level of performance. And again, England are kind of saying these are the levels that they feel were necessary without proposing this moisture risk. So that's the overall arching position there. There's nothing particularly new on the guidance in relation to existing buildings coming through from the other regions in relation to thermal bridging and air tightness. So yes, people are encouraged to make those improvements, and it can be considered in the target emissions approach, but it's not a new metric or a new additional thing to have to perform a mark of performance against. We do have a kind of note about questioning whether perhaps there's room or should be some kind of differentiation between external wall insulation and internal wall insulation. Some stakeholders have commented that external wall insulation may have a lesser risk and therefore merit a higher standard of performance. The concern might be that in doing that, you have inadvertent consequences. You encourage people to internal wall insulation, or it makes the external wall insulation more expensive as a preferred solution. These are the kind of issues that have to be sort of considered. Situation B interventions are normally predicated by trigger points. So normally you have to have a poor performance of an element. It has to be particularly poor to merit then having to do work to make it better. And those trigger points are listed there, or examples of them are there. And England's consultation has noted and retained that approach, and has noted that the standards it's requiring are cost effective to cover most upgrades. They didn't particularly want to address cavity walls, it would seem an expectation that anything more than cavity fill should be required there. And they suggest that changes to the threshold value would only capture a negligible amount of new work. So, and they have not been changed for that reason. But we have noticed that trigger point thresholds don't seem to be so applicable in Scotland or Republic of Ireland, where the expectation is that the relevant standard will apply in a change of use, change of energy status for renovation work, irrespective of the element's previous performance. So there isn't the same poor performance necessary to justify doing the work to bring it up to scratch. It just has to meet a certain standard. We've also noticed that Scotland's standards that it expects are much closer to a new build expectations when a material change of use is occurring. So if you're an office block and you're converting to dwellings, but you're not really doing any work, nonetheless, the expectation is that that wall performs pretty well close to the new build walls standard. So a bit like an extension would have been treated, the new wall would have to meet the new build standard as opposed to the retained element standard. So it's in Scotland that falls into situation A, in the rest of the UK it falls into situation B. But Scotland's guidance is quite carefully written so that it has greater flexibility for traditional building situations. So that's a kind of something of a consideration. And we'd also kind of note, just coming back to our suggestion about ourselves trying to imbue or strengthen the emphasis on traditional building and the care that's needed. Scotland has a definition for it. It does appear in some of the other technical guidance booklets too, but it refers to a building or part of a building of a type constructed before around 1919 using construction techniques that were common then and with permeable components in a way which promotes the dissipation of moisture from the building fabric. We think it might actually be dissipation of vapor, moisture vapor from the building fabric, but that's where we need to go. So that's that definition is probably worth our while considering. But if anyone has anything else about that or concerns that they're the date limit is arbitrary, or there should be a different date limit here, or that these techniques, with bio-based materials and things might be more relevant even to new build construction or something, that's something that we're open to hearing and taking evidence on. Minimum fabric standards in existing buildings. So the department, our overall conclusion on all of this, on our current position and direction of travel, unless something comes through in the feedback, is really that new and replacement elements should be largely in line with the expectations for new dwellings. So we'll be looking to implement something, depending on what we do on new dwellings, will impact what we do here. But if you were to follow England, we'd be more likely to follow the kind of expectations of the standards that England has outlined in its current guidance. Given the technical risks, a lesser performance is obviously appropriate to the to apply to situations of material change of use or where you're retaining or renovating an existing element. And we also think there's further or additional considerations need to be outlined or promoted where it is a protected building or where traditional construction is used. We come to that in point E. Guidance on the installation of insulation will include an increased emphasis on the sealing of air gaps. We think that that's an important kind of theme that has also come up, in some of the English measures. And we think that's an important aspect of things. If the air can circulate around an insulated panel or in through cracks, it's of limited benefit, obviously. And the extent of glazing should generally be expected to be no more than 25% of the floor area, as kind of currently applies. And an increased emphasis on considerations and provisions for traditional construction should be made. So we're looking or hoping that there'll be updated guidance from NIEA or DFC, and we'd also expect that it might be reasonable to refer to expert or specialist assessment in some of these cases. So we're not thinking that the guidance on the traditional construction would be fully hammered out within our own guidance. We'd be kind of referring out on that point because it's such a developing area, and it just needs such a case-by-case judgment. So we've asked a range of questions on that, which I don't think there's any need to go through now, but it's broadly going through those same questions or same issues that we've outlined. And I also wanted to note that, and we'll cover this more in our next session, but there are measures, just to reassure people, there's a proposed measure under the ventilation section. So that's where energy efficiency improvements which are made to a dwelling are kind of categorized as major or minor, and they stack up to then put you into category A, B, or C for the extent of ventilation consideration that you might need. From memory, category A would be wouldn't really require you to do anything. Category B would allow you to, you might want to make some reconsideration of your natural ventilation or something, and C would require more a more mechanically led approach, perhaps. So that will be outlined properly or more authoritatively in our next session. But this principle of doing these things and adding up into this table, I think, is just worth noting today. A further thing that's happening is that the Domestic Building Services Compliance Guide, that has been brought into the approved document in England and in Wales, and it was always in the Ireland's guidance. In contrast, Scotland has retained separate guides, which do seem to provide more wide-ranging, more informative explanation for what's happening and why they're there and why the decisions are the way they are, as opposed to, if they're in the technical guidance, it's really there to try and demonstrate compliance or not, or to try and draw a clear kind of datum, as clear as possible, a datum of performance expectations for common building situations. So you get a different tone. So if people are able to look at the two options and consider which they think is the more appropriate, our sort of current expectation would be that it's better to have it all in the one place and have it all available. And that would be where we kind of tend to go. There is something of an issue that we'll be have to consider in an ongoing way in relation to eco-design requirements. We believe that everything in the current English AD is up to scratch, certainly as far as eco-design 2018 standards are concerned, but there could be issues about Northern Ireland having to maintain ongoing compliance with EU eco-design requirements, and that's a longer term measure or longer term consideration that we might need to think about a bit more as we move forward, and whether or not, if they are dynamically changing, we need to refer to the way that you can find it out and refer directly to that to see whether the boiler or the heat exchanger or whatever it is you're using is meeting the relevant eco-design requirement. We also think it's worth just noting an uplift that occurred in England fairly quietly, without too much, as far as we're aware here, wasn't really pushed here. But in 2018, England introduced a Boiler Plus standard to apply whenever a boiler is installed in an existing dwelling. So it's arguably a consequential improvement measure, in that it's saying when you install a boiler, we want you to really look at some of these additional controls and things. So the changes were mainly focused on the gas boiler sector, and they would mean that a replacement boiler would need, first of all, to use the ERP seasonal efficiency as standard, and should be a minimum of 92% and not and not significantly less than the efficiency of the appliance being replaced. It should install a boiler interlock and time and temperature controls, and then additionally for gas-fired combi boilers, there's a range of 4 items on one of those technologies should be installed alongside it. So it makes a boiler replacement more expensive, but it gives you better controls alongside that. So that was a measure introduced in England. So that would form part of the overall package. And there's also there were less there was not a lot of concentration on oil boilers in that package, but there is a requirement for time and temperature controls for oil boilers when they're done. So that was there. And yeah, okay, so that's all still there. There's a slight difference between the ERP and the ZBUC class assessment, which we think is still used for the carbon and primary energy SAP assessments. So that's just something to bear in mind. In addition to this, the new measures were introduced in 2022 in all GB regions to require thermostatic controls. So England's latest uplift have also brought in a requirement for thermostatic controls when a heating appliance is installed, and that applies both to new builds and to replacements. And it means that effectively you could require thermostats and thermostatic radiator valves controls might be the outcome whenever you at a room by room level, and that flows from a requirement from Article 8 of the EPBD as amended in 2018. So theoretically, we were still those requirements are something that GB or UK kind of has agreed to try to implement. So we'd be looking to try and replicate that. So the question asks is there to ask questions on that. Similarly, then we outlined this in the new build section 3A, that when new heating systems are installed either in new buildings or where a complete replacement system is installed in an existing dwelling, the expectation would be that that should operate at with a maximum flow temperature of 55 degrees C, so a relatively low temperature system requirement. It makes the existing boilers work more efficient, or it means standard boilers and condensing boilers can operate more effectively, but it also helps future-proof the home toward future replacement again with some of the lower carbon technologies. And it would apply obviously in both new and where a completely new replacement system, but it wouldn't apply if you're just replacing a boiler. It wouldn't apply if you're just replacing some pipework or something. So it would need a complete sort of building refit. We've also got the issue of the new primary energy check. So if you are changing your fuel at the minute, the current guidance requires that you shouldn't be any worse than 2 percentage points in terms of efficiency performance from the system you were on. And it also requires a conversion, a CO2 emissions factor assessment to make sure that the fuel you're replacing it with isn't any worse in terms of emissions than the one you originally had. So it's quite an onerous assessment, and that will continue, but there would now also be an additional primary energy assessment, which would be part of that, and that again is to stay consistent with the metrics that are being deployed and the requirements that are deployed for the new build sector. And there's some sort of consequences to that we've outlined in the document. And we also review an alternative, which is Scotland's delivered energy route. And so it has implications for wood pellet boilers being installed in existing buildings. And it also has an interesting one in that if you follow the PE assessment for England and Wales, you find that replacing with an electric boiler with the PE factors that are in England's table 12 of SAP, you find that effectively means direct electric solutions are that bit more difficult, whereas direct electric isn't so much of an issue under the Scottish assessment. At least that was our assessment of how that would roll out. So if people are finding that, or if they're working in England or in Scotland are finding these differences or have any comments on that, that's kind of something that we're interested to hear about. We should just note that the direct electric scenario wouldn't apply in England. They do have an additional clause. So if the heat loss of the dwelling is less than 25 kilowatt hours per square meter per year, and if you can demonstrate that or show that, then this assessment, this PE requirement wouldn't necessarily be applicable. We have a question also, just we're noting that biofuels are kind of possibly increasing, liquid biofuels and things, and we're just asking about reversion back to risks of potential reversion back to conventional kerosene or conventional home heating oil, if that's a risk, or how that might be controlled. So we'd be interested to hear from industry. We'll be trying to find out a bit more about that. The risk we have is that, as I say, if these were to be illicitly restored, we've got a general expectation that our regulations will make it very clear that a change of fuel would include a change from home heating oil to a biofuel or something like that, a change of from one type of liquid oil fuel to another, that would be explicitly be a fuel change, as opposed to it's just a liquid fuel or something, or a liquid oil. So we'll make it very clear about that. Service efficiency improvements. So there are a range of minimum service efficiency improvements. They're listed here. We're not aware that any of them are terrifically an issue, but we'd be interested if there are people. I mean, we're not mechanical engineers. We don't necessarily have the insight on this that could be useful. So we'd be keen for building services sector if there are any difficulties with that having been introduced in other regions, or if there is an aspect of that needs greater consideration. We'd be open to opinions on it and to hearing what's going on. But our general expectation would be to move in line with those developments following England. Similarly, obviously, if there are aspects of it which are need further development or consideration because they don't go far enough, again, we'd be keen to hear opinions and to hear if society is generally in agreement with this or not. We have a section on consequential improvements, and this is an interesting area. So consequential improvements require additional work to be done than the work you were originally intending to do. So an example of it there was the Boiler Plus, where you're expected to install some controls whilst you're replacing your boiler. I only wanted to replace my boiler. Why do I have to spend an extra £300, £400 installing these controls, or whatever it may be? And the problem can be that if you set those requirements as a very onerous level, you might actually put people off doing the work at all, or you may overly impact people who are carrying out kind of an emergency replacement or something. So it's a balancing act on consequential improvements. There's also a similar kind of thing tends to apply to major renovations. There's also particular consequential improvements or particular aspect of this which is applicable under Regulation 41. So it applies a requirement to, if you're extending or doing work to a large building over 1,000 square meters, you spend a portion of that on improvements to the existing building. We don't really see that as being, maybe it applies to blocks of flats or something, but we don't really see it as applying very often on the dwelling side of things. So we'll discuss that more in section 4B, which we'll come to. So it's noticeable that Scotland has no requirements on the domestic section of its guidance on consequential improvements that we were able to find. But Wales does. Wales has quite an interesting proposal which we discuss in the document. So we'll move on to that in Wales now. So the measures in Wales are relate to extensions. So where there's an increase in the area of less than 10 square meters, the Wales suggests that loft insulation should definitely be improved to greater than 250 millimeters thickness. If there's an extension occurring and there's an increase in areas is more 10 square meters or more, then there's a range of basically cavity wall insulation, cylinder jacket, and loft insulation should all be carried out on the existing dwelling. And that would be kind of the basic set of interventions, the most basic set of interventions that should be done on the existing dwelling, if it's suitable for those interventions. And we think that they seem to us to be very pragmatic, low risk and proportionate measures. If you're spending all this money on an extension, you should make some modicum of improvement to your existing dwelling if it hasn't already received these measures. So we're keen to receive opinion as to whether something like this would be appropriate as far as extensions to dwellings are concerned. This is very much a requirement only whenever there's an extension to the dwelling, that these additional measures on the existing building might be suitable to be required. Major renovations then are another similar kind of idea, and it's defined, a major renovation is defined as the renovation of a building where more than 25% of the surface area of the building envelope undergoes renovations. And it comes really from the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, so it's very much an EU-led focus. And the UK's interpretation of this is that if individual elements are being renovated as part of a major renovation project, then the whole of each individual element must be upgraded to the improved U value outlined by the guidance. So there's a difference in interpretation in the language of the directive here, I think, is at core. But ROI, the Republic of Ireland, has a different interpretation, and it sets additional requirements and expectations really for more consequential improvements if a major renovation is being carried out. So it expects a whole building performance up to a cost optimal level. So it's expecting more measures to be applied to the whole building. And so there are two ways forward. Basically, if you fall into the work being in the scope of major renovation in the Republic, there are two ways forward. One is modelling to demonstrate that the whole building's energy requirement of 125 kilowatt hours per square metre per year has been achieved. And that's for the normal regulated uses as would apply under their DAP assessment or domestic energy assessment procedure. Or alternatively, there are various specific measures like basically boiler and controls upgrades, loft and wall insulation, and they're all sort of required to be carried out and are considered to be cost optimal if your work, certain major renovation work takes place. So we have noticed though that there are kind of reasonably significant exclusions to the ROI requirements. So 25% of the building envelope, they're excluding cavity wall insulation, which seems quite a large thing. They're excluding things like if you're adding wet plaster layer and stuff like that. So it really seems to apply largely where one is involving external wall insulation or internal wall insulation as part of the work. So by and large, we see those as quite significant exclusions, and we wonder, is there ways that people will game their way around these additional requirements? So perhaps the phased applications to do up a part of a building and then another part of a building, or perhaps in some other mechanism. So we're keen to receive evidence on the success or otherwise of the major renovation measures in force in the Republic, but at this stage the complexity and the extent of exclusions suggest it may not be a priority here. It may function in other areas, perhaps if there were major deep retrofit grants or something, that might be there, but that's not really core to our considerations at the minute. The department is particularly alert to unintended complexities that might emerge. So again, we gave this example earlier, but would external wall insulation be discouraged if it triggers a requirement for a boiler upgrade alongside the work? Might that blow the budget and mean that you can't do the project, or that it's just people just don't want to do that as part of the package? So you actually inadvertently put people off doing work or make retrofit more expensive. So that covers dwellings as best as I can in the time I have. And I'm going to move quickly on then to buildings other than dwellings, and hopefully this will be a slightly shorter section. Again, you have the three basic general approaches, and again, you have the general expectation of a primary energy performance alongside the carbon assessment measure when an equivalent target approach is used. The fees requirement that was being talked about for dwellings isn't something that's introduced on the non-domestic and the buildings other than dwellings side of things. So the fees assessment side of things isn't there. Again, you have these A to F scenarios. Again, you have situation A and situation B kind of expectations. Again, it's worth just noting here the minimum fabric standards aren't of the same uplift in scope of uplift as they are on the dwelling side, so far as we can see. And I think that you have to bear in mind there are lots of buildings where maybe cooling is a significant load. So there's more significant considerations. Again, it's down to new build limiting values in most places. Scotland has an interesting little adaptation where it applies slightly higher standards for domestic type situations. I presume that means things like care homes, maybe student accommodation blocks, things like that. So it's looking for a higher standard there, although I think I noticed there it is maybe slightly lower standards in one or two aspects. So that's a point that we kind of draw attention to. There's no real change on the expectations on glazing limits for extensions or for expectations around that. Still looking at 40% figure for most buildings in terms of side-lit extent of glazing, so 40% of the wall. Curiously, these areas are provided in terms of percentage of the wall, whereas some of the areas for material changes of use assessment are very much on the basis of the total floor area. And then the situation B kind of performances, again, quite similar to the scenario for dwellings. Scotland really requires the new build standards to be applied, no matter what, without the same trigger points, but has more consideration for traditional building scenarios, such that the fabric should be improved so far as practicable. And again, we're minded that the risks of moisture permeable traditional construction, and our general expectation would be that standard B performances should be a commonly attainable default standard for most situations, and then with extended emphasis on consideration of traditional construction to promote a thoughtful approach, encouraging expert judgment where necessary. So that's our kind of thoughts or general direction for that. And that's reflected again in the provisions, largely in line with the provisions for dwellings, so far as I can tell. Consideration of the existing glazing such that it should generally be no more than 25% of the floor area should continue to be part of the assessment and material change of use situation. So we're still applying those kind of expectations, and we still have questions on the same vein. Minimum services standards are again a more wide-ranging and complex area, obviously, than in dwellings. So we've outlined these in a separate annex, in Annex E. And we couldn't, when we reviewed it, see any particular difference between these minimum standards in the three regions in GB. So that gives us reasonable confidence that what's being proposed here ought to be appropriate here. This is an extract from Annex E, and it shows the figures in brackets show the current provisions in here, since they were actually brought in alongside the last uplift, because we moved to the non-domestic compliance guide in our last uplift from 2012. So those are the figures in grey, are our current standards. And there are some improvements in this, some significant improvements, I suppose. For example, for oil boilers, moving from 84 to 93% seems quite significant. Some of the gas boiler improvements too. But we're wondering, or we're alert to the fact that energy-related products and eco-design requirements and things, we're expecting that these are the kind of standards that are commonly sold in any case. So this is where the kind of eco-design, constant improvement probably has got ahead of building regulations. So we'll be interested if that's not the case, or if we've made some misassumption there, or if people having worked in England or in other regions are finding that these are actually quite difficult to achieve. Well, do let us know, or communicate to us on that. In terms of consequential improvements, so this is where regulation, is it forgotten the actual regulations of 41 perhaps, certainly requires the more consideration because of this 1,000 square meter threshold. So it all kind of stems from Article 6 of a directive from 2002, which kind of got changed or altered and moved and developed. But that's what kind of set the kind of the 1,000 square meter threshold, such as it was. And as I've said before, there are risks in all these areas that requiring additional work can push the project out of bounds, or can make it unviable, or could be beyond the capacity or finances of those carrying out the work. So that covers those areas. We're also kind of alert, again, going back to the legislative requirement, because it was a directive, it needed to be all explicitly legislated for, as opposed to used, qualified or explained in guidance. That we think that there's a scope for potentially a simpler approach in this area. So we're alert to that. There's a range of approaches to consequential improvements. Here the expectation is, if you're building an extension to an existing building with a total useful floor area of greater than 1,000 square meters, then, or if you're extending building services into a building or through a building, the expectation is that you'll spend 10% of the principal works, additional 10% on the improvements to the existing building. England's guidance, we're in step with England on this, but England's guidance was updated in 2021-22, suggesting that a very minor change, suggesting that more improvements, or the threshold for when you make an improvement to your lighting should be reduced from 60 to 44 the circuits with an efficiency of less than 60 lumen circuit watts could be upgraded, rather than the previous thresholds of 40 and 45 lumens per circuit watt. So there's a slight push to do more with lighting, but it doesn't seem to us to be terribly huge or significant change in this area. Just thought it was worth drawing breath before we just follow England to look and notice that Scotland has a slightly different approach. So it applies a 10% requirement where the value of the work is £50,000 or more, and involves the extension of the existing building services. So that's a slightly different kind of set of rules, rather than the 1,000 square meters. And so you could argue that they've more consequential improvement scenarios might kick in. But they only require 5% of the cost of the principal work, to be spent on appropriate service measures within the existing building. And they do not require or take the fabric improvement into account. So I think from having reviewed it, I think it's really related to the services that they really focus on, and that's the aspect there. Wales applies the 10% rule, but doesn't have any thresholds. So the costs of the extension are expected to be applied to improve the existing building, irrespective of its size or the cost of the extension. So it is an ongoing 10% rule. Although it does have that rule, if it's in relation to the extension of services into an existing building. So maybe you have 2 floors of a building and the 3rd floor is unheated, and you're extending the services into that unheated 3rd floor space, then the rule would apply. It would only apply for 1,000 square metre. So there's a slightly complicated position in England. In general, in any case, we're keen to receive evidence, maybe from district councils in particular, but on how often this is actually occurring. How is this something, and is this something that should be kind of retained and kept on in keeping with England? Is it something that should maybe be amended or extended, perhaps a bit more like Scotland or Wales, or is it actually something that no one ever does? They find ways around it. They gameplay. They build an extension as a detached building and then build a little link, and that somehow it's only the link that then gets applied, and it escapes the threshold or applies a very low level of cost interventions. Are these interventions, are these regulations worth continuing with, or is it something that might actually be revoked? So at first it might seem like it doesn't encourage holistic retrofit, but if the costs involved are encouraging building owners to do kind of slightly strange things to avoid it, or if they're just not working, or it's just not kind of being effective, is it something it would, removing this requirement, because it's quite a complicated one to explain, and it's quite a significant portion of the guidance, and it's quite a significant part of the legislation. Would it help to simplify? What can we do to help simplify and make this a slightly easier proposition? Finally, then, major renovations. Again, same definition obviously applies because it came from the directive. There's no difference. Republic of Ireland again has this different approach, and there the two routes to compliance are meeting a primary energy performance requirement. We've given two examples here at the bottom. Two examples at the bottom, or they really talk about replacing services and things which are more than 15 years old. So if you do those things, or if you obtain these levels of performance, you're deemed to have met the major renovation requirements when they've kicked in the Republic. So we're keen to receive evidence on the success or otherwise of its regime, and whether that's helpful or useful or sensible. And we're still, again, however, alert to the unintended complexities that might emerge on that. For example, are you discouraging work because you've required too much or too many other measures? It has triggered you to do 10 things when you only wanted to do 5, and you just go, you know what, it's all too much bother. So that's a bit of a race through, I hope, or an overview, or of some of the themes and issues that we've highlighted in those sections in relation to the work to existing buildings. I'm conscious that we're just over an hour in here, and I don't know if there've been any questions. It's a really kind of complicated area, how you do this work, and there can be all sorts of ins and outs and difficulties with it. So apologies if we may not be able to answer every question at every occasion, and we certainly don't have the mechanical expertise necessarily. So we're alert to that. Just to say that our next sessions, then we have a week off next week, but we're back the week after, and it'll be the ventilation proposals for phase 3, and then there are subsequent sessions after that, before our consultation closes on the 15th of November. So we look forward to following up with you then. And finally, if you have any queries or contacts, or can't read information, or want more clarity, or a specific point, we'd like consultation responses to be through the consultation. But if you have issues you wish to raise, or some problem, please do contact us. We're keen to make contact. So that's our details. And if we leave it at that, that's us. Thank you.